One of the saddest lines in the Bible relates to the life of Samson. God had called him and chosen him before he was even born to be his instrument, to be his hero, his leader, that he was to be God's instrument, to be empowered to free God's people from the oppression that they suffered. And God had empowered him. He accomplished amazing feats. But over time, he succumbed to Delilah's manipulations, the pressure, her continued desire to know the secret of his success, the secret of his strength. And again, he eventually succumbed to that. Now, we would, looking back, reflecting upon it, it's easy to look back from the outside and say, why didn't somewhere along the line he just put a stop to this? But he did succumb. And as soon as she found out the real secret, what did she do? She immediately used it against him. Lulled him to sleep, tied him up, cut his hair, and when he awoke, he assumed that he would do what he's always done, that he would have the strength to break the ropes and gain the victory he'd always gained. But then he wasn't. He was weak. And it says, Samson didn't realize the Lord had left him. And that's why I think that's one of the saddest lines in the Bible, that it took the crisis for him to recognize that the Lord had left him. Now, for you and I, we live in a time of grace because of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, which is a good thing because we are going to miss it from time to time. The only one who did it perfect was Jesus. And the beauty of grace is God is continually leaning towards us, wooing us, and all it takes is for us to recognize we did blow it and just to turn around, just to go back. But I do want to focus on one area that we need to pay attention to, and that's the blessings fading. And let me explain what I mean. See, the Bible repeatedly talks about things that are blessings in our life, blessings that accelerate us, empower us, give us momentum. Because again, remember, blessing is when you're blessed is when you're tapped into God's power source. And it creates that supernatural momentum that brings radical transformation. Now, can you navigate life as a believer separate from God's blessings? Well, yes, but would you really want to? And there's so many. A great example. It says when you honor your father and mother, it will go well with you. You'll live long in the land. You'll be blessed. In fact, in the New Testament, Paul says it's the first commandment with a promise. So in other words, the promise is that when you honor your father and mother, that it will go well with you. You'll be blessed. It's pretty straightforward. But the challenge becomes when we get out of alignment of those blessings. We would assume that those blessings, when we're out of alignment, we kind of get this out like it's a light switch. So like immediately it gets turned off. Like all of a sudden you would recognize, hang on, what just happened? Back up, let's fix this. And in some ways that would be helpful because it would be obvious that we got out of alignment. We missed it somewhere. But with God's mercy, it doesn't work that way. Because of God's mercy, what happens is, rather than this simple on and off switch, when we get out of alignment, God's mercy means that the blessing just begins to fade. It begins to lose the power, the momentum, the acceleration, and so on. And what happens is we eventually wind up like Samson, that only when it gets to crisis mode do we start to realize, hang on, what's wrong? Where did we miss it? And even then, obviously, sometimes we don't even recognize what it was because it was so far back. Now, again, can you navigate life without the blessings? Sure, but the point is, not only do blessings accelerate your life, they're also the things that become part of your distinction. And what I mean by that is, those blessings are where other people begin to recognize there's something different about you. It's not something you say, it's not a sign that you're wearing, but it is this obvious part of your identity. How many times was it said of God's people in the Old Testament, it's obvious God is with you? That it should be something we desire, if for no other reason that it does create that distinction that causes people to want to know, what is it different? What is it that makes this work for you? But going back to the blessing fading, and I've told this story before, but it's the best way I know to really talk about how we begin to, if we're not careful, we begin to cut off the blessings. So I had a younger brother who was actually bigger than me, and we shared a room. And when we would get into a spat, usually what would happen is I'd run into the room, and we didn't have a lock on the door, and so I would put my foot at the base of the door, it meant he couldn't get in, but the door would move a bit, it would flex. You could get your fingers through the gap. And sometimes that's what we do, is our actions, we succumb to that persistent, whether it's deception, temptation, whatever it is, that causes us to come out of alignment with those things that provide that blessing. And again, it's just like with my brother in that door, that gap that the blessing could come through, so to speak, was so tiny, rather than throwing the door wide open so God can do more. Now again, the beauty is when we recognize we're out of alignment, the simplicity with God is just, again, turning around. And there's so many ways we can initiate blessing in our life. We can honor our father and mother. We can honor the leaders in our life. Each one of us should have leaders in our life. There's so many areas where we can initiate and release blessing that brings that acceleration. In fact, here's a little tidbit, a little special one. Psalm 67 says that when you praise the Lord, a consequence is He releases His blessings. And praise being not just nice Christian songs, but really extolling His virtues. Just one of the benefits of praising the living God. But really the point becomes this, that for us to be those heroes of the faith, for us to be those warriors of the kingdom that are bringing that radical transformation that God's looking for, it's got to be through His Spirit. And the blessing is something that, again, creates this distinction for each one that makes it so obvious that the world can't deny it. So the question becomes, when do you periodically stop and reflect on those things in your life? Do you ever take the time to look back and say, hey, am I doing this? Better yet, every time you recognize in the Word a blessing initiator, we'll call them, do you stop and reflect on not just am I doing it, but how can I do this better, more effectively? Don't be complacent in just assuming I've got it. Take it to the next level. Start to say, how can I do this to an even greater degree? Don't succumb to the fact that the blessing fading means we so often will miss it. Don't let it come to a crisis. Be those people of distinction that the world can't deny, and they want to know more.